John was tired of the city's constant noise and stress. He craved peace, a place where he could unplug and breathe fresh air. So when he found a listing for a secluded cabin deep in the woods, it seemed perfect. No neighbors, no traffic, just nature and quiet. He booked it for the weekend without a second thought. The drive took him farther from civilization than he'd ever been. Paved roads turned to gravel, and gravel turned to dirt. Towering trees lined the path, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sun. His GPS lost signal miles back, but the handwritten directions led him right to the cabin. It was quaint, almost picturesque. A small wooden structure with a wraparound porch nestled among the pines. The afternoon sun cast long shadows, and the only sounds were birds chirping and leaves rustling. Exactly what I needed, John sighed, grabbing his bags. Inside, the cabin was cozy but basic. A small kitchen, a living area with a stone fireplace, and a bedroom upstairs. No TV, no Wi-Fi, but that was the point. He wanted to disconnect. After unpacking, he made himself a simple dinner and settled on the porch with a book. The silence was comforting at first, a stark contrast to the honking horns and chatter of the city. As dusk fell, the forest around him grew quieter. The birds stopped singing, and an unsettling stillness took over. He brushed it off. Just not used to how quiet it is out here, he thought. That night, he climbed into the soft bed and quickly fell asleep. But around 2 a.m., he woke up to a faint sound. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the window. Half asleep, he figured it was a tree branch. But then he remembered. The nearest tree was several feet away. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate. Curiosity got the better of him. He got up and walked to the window, pulling back the curtain. Nothing but darkness. The moonlight barely pierced through the thick woods. He shrugged and went back to bed. Must be a bird, he mumbled. The next morning, sunlight streamed in, and the strange tapping felt like a distant memory. Determined to enjoy his day, he decided to explore the woods. He packed a small backpack with water and snacks and set off. The forest was beautiful. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting dappled shadows on the ground. He followed a narrow trail, breathing in the scent of pine and earth. Hours passed as he wandered, snapping photos of anything that caught his eye. Eventually, he stumbled upon a clearing he hadn't seen on the map. In the center stood an old stone well, covered in moss and vines. Something about it drew him in. He approached cautiously. The air around the well was cooler, and the sounds of the forest seemed distant. Peering over the edge, he saw nothing but darkness. "Hello?" he called, his voice echoing faintly. No response. A chill ran down his spine. He stepped back, deciding it was time to head back to the cabin. As he retraced his steps, the forest felt different. The trees seemed taller, the path narrower. The friendly chirping of birds was replaced by an eerie silence. Shadows stretched in unnatural ways, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He quickened his pace, heart pounding. Relief washed over him when he finally spotted the cabin through the trees. But something was off. The front door was slightly open. "I know I closed that," he whispered. He stepped inside cautiously. The air inside was cold and an odd smell lingered, damp and earthy. His belongings were just as he'd left them, but the sense of unease grew stronger. Deciding he was just being paranoid, he made himself dinner and tried to relax. As night fell, he lit a fire and settled onto the couch with a book. Then came the tapping. This time it was louder. Tap, tap, tap. But it wasn't coming from the window. It was coming from the front door. His stomach tightened. Maybe someone got lost, he thought. He approached the door slowly. "Hello, can I help you?" he called out. No answer. He took a deep breath and opened the door. No one was there. Just the dark outline of the forest and the faint rustling of leaves. He stepped outside, scanning the area. "Is anyone there?" he shouted. Silence. He went back inside, double-locking the door. His heart wouldn't stop racing. He He tried to distract himself by reading, but every little creak made him jump. Around midnight, he decided to call it a night. Sleep came in fits, filled with strange dreams of whispers and shadows. At 3 a.m., he awoke to a scraping sound. It was coming from upstairs. He sat up, ears straining. The sound was steady, like someone dragging something heavy across the floor. "This can't be real," he told himself. Gathering his courage, he grabbed a flashlight and crept up the stairs. The scraping stopped. At the top, the hallway was pitch black. He clicked on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. The bedroom door was ajar. He pushed it open slowly. The room was empty, but the window was wide open, curtains fluttering in the cold breeze. He approached the window and looked out. The beam of his flashlight revealed nothing unusual. He closed the window and secured the latch. Turning around, he nearly screamed. On the mirror above the dresser, words were scrawled in what looked like mud. "Leave now." His hands shook. He wiped at the words, and the substance smeared across the glass, confirming it was real. Panic set in. He grabbed his essentials, stuffing them into his backpack. He needed to get out. As he rushed downstairs, the lights flickered. The shadows in the room seemed to shift and move on their own. He heard footsteps behind him. Slow, deliberate. He didn't dare look back. Fumbling with the lock, he threw the door open and sprinted to his car. The engine roared to life, and he sped down the dirt road. In his rearview mirror, he thought he saw a figure standing in the cabin doorway watching him leave. The drive back to the city was a blur. Only when he reached his apartment did he feel somewhat safe. But the ordeal wasn't over. The next day, he discovered strange photos on his phone. Images of him sleeping in the cabin taken from inside the room. His blood ran cold. "Who could have taken these?" he whispered. He went to the police, but without evidence of a crime, there was little they could do. Over the next few days, odd things kept happening. He'd wake up to find muddy footprints leading from his front door to his bedroom. Objects in his apartment were moved or misplaced. Desperate, he researched the area around the cabin. He found an old article about a man who'd lived there decades ago, a recluse rumored to have dabbled in dark rituals. Locals believed his spirit still lingered, angry at anyone who disturbed his solitude. Determined to end this nightmare, John sought out a local paranormal expert. The woman listened intently as he recounted his experiences. "You've attracted a vengeful spirit," she said. "It followed you from the cabin." "How do I get rid of it?" he asked. "You need to return and make amends. Leave an offering. Ask for forgiveness." Fear clenched at his heart. The last thing he wanted was to go back, but he saw no other choice. He gathered what he was told, a bundle of sage, a candle, and a written apology. Driving back to the cabin felt like walking into a trap. The forest seemed darker, more oppressive. When he arrived, the cabin looked abandoned, more dilapidated than before. Vines crawled up the walls, and the windows were boarded up. He followed the path to the old well. Standing before it, he lit the candle and burned the sage, reciting the apology aloud. "I didn't mean to disturb you, I'm sorry. Please leave me be." The wind picked up, swirling leaves around him. A whisper echoed through the trees. "Go." He felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Back home, the disturbances stopped. No more footprints, no more photos. Sleep came easier, and life began to return to normal. But sometimes, late at night, he'd hear faint tapping on his window. He'd tell himself it was just a branch, but deep down he knew he was never truly alone. Have you ever worked the late night shift, believing the quiet would bring peace and easy hours? Let me share a story that will make you question every solitary moment you've ever spent alone in the dark. By the end, you'll never look at the night the same way again. This isn't just another spooky tale. It's the harrowing experience of someone who thought the worst they'd face at work was boredom. But one night, something happened that defied explanation, something that clung to them long after dawn broke. If you've ever felt like unseen eyes were watching you from the shadows, this story will resonate with a fear you've tried to ignore. Sam was your typical night shift worker, practical, grounded, and utterly skeptical of anything remotely supernatural. No fear of ghosts, no belief in curses. The paranormal was just fodder for cheesy horror movies. Working the graveyard shift at a convenience store? Easy money. No daytime traffic, no managers hovering, and plenty of time to themselves. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and left Sam with a sense of freedom. The store itself was as ordinary as they come. Harsh fluorescent lights cast a sterile glow over neatly stocked aisles of snacks and canned goods. The faint scent of lemon-scented cleaner lingered in the air, a constant reminder of nightly routines. If anything, the place felt too sanitized to be unsettling, but its location told a different story. Perched on the outskirts of a sleepy town, the store was isolated, surrounded by endless fields that whispered in the wind on one side and an abandoned, crumbling road on the other. The nearest neighbor was a mile away, a lone farmhouse that rarely showed signs of life. Most nights it felt like the rest of the world had forgotten this place existed. Hours could pass without a single customer crossing the threshold. Sam used to joke that their only fear was dying of boredom. But on this particular night, something felt off. It started subtly, a prickling sensation at the back of the neck, as if someone were watching. The air seemed heavier, laden with an unspoken tension that pressed in from all sides. The fluorescent lights above buzzed incessantly, their harsh glow flickering ever so slightly, casting dancing shadows that played tricks on the eyes. Sam couldn't pinpoint why, but every instinct screamed that something was amiss. They glanced around the store. Everything looked the same. The shelves were orderly, the floor spotless, the hum of the refrigerators a constant backdrop. Yet the atmosphere had shifted, charged with an undercurrent of unease. Then, the automatic sliding doors at the entrance hissed open. Sam looked up from their phone, expecting to see a late-night customer wandering in, perhaps a trucker looking for coffee or a teenager craving snacks. But no one entered. The doors gaped open, revealing only the inky darkness beyond. The parking lot was empty, illuminated by a single flickering street lamp that cast erratic shadows across the asphalt. Frowning, Sam peered into the night. Their car sat alone under the unreliable glow, and beyond that, nothing but the vast expanse of field shrouded in darkness. The wind rustled through the tall grass, a soft whisper that seemed amplified in the stillness. Probably just the wind, Sam muttered, though doubt gnawed at the edges of their mind. The doors remained open longer than usual, almost hesitating, before sliding shut with a reluctant hiss. The sound echoed unnaturally, louder than it should have been in the empty store. They tried to shrug it off, attributing it to a faulty sensor. The doors had acted up before, after all. Yet, a lingering unease settled in their stomach, a flutter of anxiety they couldn't quite shake. Returning to their phone, Sam attempted to distract themselves with social media and mindless games. But the oppressive silence pressed in, broken only by the buzzing lights and the faint hum of refrigeration units. Even those familiar sounds seemed muted, swallowed by the heavy atmosphere. Minutes ticked by with excruciating slowness. Sam found their gaze repeatedly drawn to the security monitors, a grid of grainy black and white feeds displaying empty aisles and a deserted parking lot. Nothing out of the ordinary, yet the screens offered little comfort. Then it happened again. The automatic doors slid open with a sharp hiss. Sam's head snapped up, heart pounding. Once more, the entrance revealed only the empty night. This time, the street lamp outside flickered violently before plunging the parking lot into darkness. A chill crept into the store, the temperature dropping noticeably. They stared into the void beyond the doors, a sea of shadows where anything or nothing could be lurking. The doors remained open, the sensors seemingly defiant. Sam's mouth felt dry. "Hello?" They called out tentatively, their voice barely more than a whisper. No response. After what felt like an eternity, the doors closed. The soft thunk reverberated through the store, the sound unnaturally loud in the suffocating silence. Sam exhaled slowly, realizing they'd been holding their breath. Determined to shake off the creeping dread, Sam decided to busy themselves with restocking shelves. Activity might dispel the unsettling atmosphere. Grabbing a box of merchandise, they headed to aisle 3. As they worked, the routine tasks provided a semblance of normalcy. The rhythmic action of stacking items lulled them into a calmer state. But the quiet refused to be comforting. Instead, it amplified every creak and rustle. That's when they heard it. A faint crinkling sound, like someone handling a bag of chips. Sam paused, ears straining. The sound had come from the far end of the aisle. Peering down the row, they saw nothing unusual. The shelves stretched out, laden with products, illuminated by the steady glow of the overhead lights. "Hello?" they called out, their voice echoing softly. Silence. They resumed stacking, but their movements were slower now, each rustle of packaging making their hearts skip a beat. Then, out of the corner of their eye, they caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow darting just beyond sight. Sam spun around, scanning the area. Again, nothing. Just rows of neatly arranged goods and the sterile ambiance of the store. "Get a grip," they whispered, chastising themselves. Yet the unease only deepened. As they placed the last item on the shelf, a bag of chips toppled over, falling to the floor with a muted thud. Sam stared at it, a knot forming in their stomach. They had stacked everything carefully. There was no reason for anything to fall. Bending down, they picked up the bag, their hand trembling ever so slightly. A sudden chill swept through the aisle, and for a moment it felt as if someone was standing right behind them, breathing softly on the back of their neck. Sam whipped around, but the space was empty. Back at the counter, Sam tried to steady their nerves. They sipped a can of soda, the sugary liquid doing little to quell their anxiety. Their eyes flickered to the security monitors, scanning each feed for any sign of movement. That's when they saw it. On the monitor displaying aisle 3, a figure stood motionless, tall and indistinct, its features obscured by static or perhaps shadow. Sam blinked, leaning closer. The figure didn't move. Heart pounding, they glanced toward the actual aisle, which was visible from their vantage point. It was empty. Eyes darting back to the monitor, they saw that the figure was now closer to the camera, its form still blurred but undeniably present. A surge of fear coursed through them. Was the camera malfunctioning? Hallucination? They couldn't tear their eyes away. Suddenly the screen flickered and the figure vanished. Sam's breath caught in their throat. The store felt colder, the shadows deeper. They contemplated calling someone, a friend, the police. But what would they say? That a shadow was haunting their store? Hours crawled by. The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly, each minute feeling like an eternity. The oppressive silence was broken only by the occasional hum of machinery. At 1:53 a.m., the automatic doors chimed. Relief flooded Sam. A customer meant normalcy, a break in the unsettling monotony. A man entered, his face obscured by the hood of a dark jacket. He moved with an unnatural fluidity, footsteps soundless on the tiled floor. He didn't acknowledge Sam, heading straight toward the back of the store. "Welcome in," Sam called out, their voice wavering slightly. No response. They watched as the man disappeared down an aisle. Minutes passed, and he didn't reappear. A nagging feeling told Sam that something was wrong. Leaving the safety of the counter, they ventured into the aisles. The store seemed larger somehow, the aisles stretching longer than they should. The overhead lights flickered intermittently. "Sir, do you need help finding anything?" Sam's voice sounded small in the vastness of the store. Silence. Reaching the back of the store, they found the freezer section. One of the glass doors was ajar, a thin mist seeping out. Approaching cautiously, Sam peered inside. The man was nowhere to be seen. But on the fogged-up glass of the freezer door, a message was scrawled in dripping letters. "I'm still here." Sam stumbled back, a gasp escaping their lips. Their mind raced. How was that possible? They hadn't seen anyone leave, and the door's chime hadn't sounded again. A sudden noise, a whisper, brushed past their ear. They couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Mocking. Panic set in. Sam dashed back to the counter, hands shaking as they picked up the phone. They dialed 911, but the line was dead. No dial tone, just static. The lights overhead began to flicker more violently, plunging the store into alternating moments of darkness and harsh light. Shadows leaped and twisted, creating illusions of figures moving just out of sight. The whispers grew louder, emanating from all directions. They overlapped, a cacophony of unintelligible words spoken in a language Sam couldn't recognize. Covering their ears, they crouched behind the counter, eyes squeezed shut. "This isn't real," they whispered. "This isn't happening." A loud crash jolted them upright. One of the shelves had toppled over, products spilling across the floor in a chaotic heap. The whispers turned into guttural growls. Sam knew they had to get out. Grabbing their keys, they made a dash for the entrance. The automatic doors remained stubbornly shut. Frantically, they pressed the manual override, but the doors wouldn't budge. Behind them, the growling intensified. Glancing over their shoulder, they saw dark shapes emerging from the shadows, twisted forms with glowing eyes, inching closer. Desperation fueled their actions. Sam smashed the glass of the door with a fire extinguisher, shards raining down. They squeezed through the opening, ignoring the cuts from the jagged edges. Outside, the air was crisp and cold. The parking lot was bathed in the pale light of the moon, the street lamp still dark. Sam fumbled with their car keys, hands slick with blood and sweat. As they started the engine, they dared one last look at the store. The figures stood at the shattered entrance watching. Their glowing eyes pierced the darkness, and though their faces were obscured, Sam could feel their gaze, a mix of malice and something else. Hunger. They didn't wait to find out more. Tires screeched as they sped away, the store shrinking in the rearview mirror. But even as distance grew, the sense of being pursued lingered. Sam never returned to that store. They didn't call their manager, didn't explain, didn't care about the last paycheck. For weeks, sleep was elusive. Every shadow seemed to conceal a threat, every whisper of wind, a sinister voice. They moved to a new town, took a day job, surrounded themselves with people. But the memories clung like a shadow. Late at night, when darkness settled and the world grew quiet, Sam still heard it. The faint tap, tap, tap of footsteps approaching. Sometimes they'd catch a glimpse of movement in their peripheral vision, a fleeting shadow that vanished when looked at directly. And in the quiet moments between wakefulness and sleep, they'd hear the whispers. Unintelligible, yet filled with a chilling familiarity. So if you ever find yourself working alone at night, take heed. Listen closely to the silence, watch the shadows, and trust your instincts. Because sometimes the things we dismiss, the flickering lights, the unexplained sounds, the fleeting shadows, are warnings. And sometimes the darkness isn't as empty as we think. Some places aren't just cursed. They're alive, breathing, watching, waiting. Deep in the Appalachian Mountains lies Black Hollow, a place shrouded in fear and whispered about in the dark corners of small-town diners. I thought I was brave, thought I could uncover its secrets for a story. But what I found there, what I barely escaped, has left me haunted forever. And now, I'm sharing this with you. Listen closely, because once you know about Black Hollow, it knows about you. It all started with a job. A local magazine was running a feature on mysterious Appalachian folklore, and as their go-to writer for anything eerie, I was the obvious choice. The editor casually mentioned Black Hollow as a potential lead, a place known for its ghost stories, unexplained disappearances, and sinister energy. The locals wouldn't talk much about it, except to offer dire warnings. To me, the name sounded like an opportunity, a forgotten legend, ripe for exposure. I packed my gear, eager to dig into whatever dark history the Hollow might be hiding. I arrived in a tiny mountain town on the outskirts of Black Hollow, just before sundown. The town itself seemed to shrink under the shadow of the surrounding forest, its weathered buildings slouching with age. At the only gas station, I decided to test the waters. "You're not from around here," the attendant said, barely looking up from his crossword puzzle. "Nope," I replied with a smile. "I'm a writer. Heard about a place nearby. Black Hollow?" The reaction was immediate. His hand froze and his face turned pale. Without meeting my eyes, he muttered, "You don't want to go there. Nothing but bad things come out of that place." When I pressed for more details, he gave me a piece of advice. "If you're smart, you'll leave before it gets dark." Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "If you must go, take the unmarked road past Devil's Ridge. But don't say I didn't warn you." That unmarked road was easy to miss. Barely more than a dirt path, it twisted into the dense forest like a serpent. As I turned onto it, I noticed how quickly the sunlight faded. It wasn't just the canopy of trees blotting out the sky. This darkness felt unnatural, as if the hollow itself was swallowing the light. My car bumped and jolted along the uneven track. My GPS had long since lost its signal, leaving me with only the road ahead and a sense of unease that grew with every mile. The trees crowded closer, their twisted branches forming grotesque shapes that seemed to shift and writhe in my peripheral vision. Then, the radio crackled. At first, it was just static, sharp and grating. But then, through the noise, a voice emerged. Faint, distorted and chillingly calm. "Turn back," it whispered. I froze, my hand hovering over the radio dial. The voice came again, more insistent this time. "Turn back now." My heart pounded as I scanned the road ahead, half expecting to see someone standing there. But there was nothing, just the oppressive darkness and the suffocating stillness of the forest. I told myself it was just a rogue signal, interference bouncing through the mountains. But the voice stayed with me, a cold weight pressing on my chest. The road seemed endless, looping and twisting until time lost all meaning. The world outside my car felt like a void, and my headlights barely cut through the gloom. Just when I was ready to turn around, the forest opened into a clearing, and I saw it. Black Hollow Manor. The house loomed before me like a forgotten relic of nightmares. Its Victorian facade was warped and decayed, its once grand windows now dark and lifeless. Ivy crawled up its sides like veins, and the air around it seemed heavier, colder. I parked my car, the crunch of gravel beneath the tires breaking the eerie silence. My breath fogged in the unnatural chill as I stepped out. The door to the manor was slightly ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. For a moment I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to leave. But curiosity, damn curiosity, drove me forward. The floorboards groaned beneath my boots as I crossed the threshold into the shadowy interior. The air inside was thick with dust and the scent of rot. Cobwebs stretched across every corner, and the faded wallpaper peeled like dead skin. My flashlight barely illuminated the room, its beam swallowed by the oppressive darkness. In the parlor, I found a desk covered in yellowed papers and brittle books. One book caught my eye, a leather-bound journal, its cover marked with strange symbols. The handwriting inside was frantic, the words scrawled as if in desperation. "Do not go to the basement," one entry read. "It's not empty down there. It never is." A cold shiver ran down my spine. I told myself I was here for answers, for a story. But as I stood there in the oppressive silence of that house, I wasn't so sure anymore. My flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering like a dying flame. I tapped it, but the light refused to stabilize. And then, from somewhere deep within the house, I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible. But it grew louder, closer, echoing through the hollow halls. I followed the sound, my steps hesitant and my breath shallow. It led me to a door at the end of a narrow corridor, a door that creaked open on its own as I approached. Behind it, a staircase spiraled into darkness. The basement. The air grew colder as I descended, each step feeling like a leap into an abyss. The smell of damp earth and decay grew stronger, mingling with something metallic, something that made my stomach churn. At the bottom, my flashlight revealed a cavernous space carved into the rock. Symbols like those on the journal's cover were etched into the walls, glowing faintly with an unnatural light. And in the center of the room stood a mirror. The mirror was ancient, its surface tarnished and cracked. But when I looked into it, I didn't see my reflection. I saw shadows, shifting, writhing shadows that seemed to reach for me. And then something moved behind me. I spun around, but the cavern was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the shadows had taken form. A figure stood there, impossibly tall and thin, its face obscured by a veil of darkness. My flashlight flickered violently and the air grew heavier, pressing down on me like a physical weight. The figure stepped closer in the mirror, its clawed hands reaching for the glass. And then, the glass shattered. The sound was deafening, a cacophony that reverberated through the cavern. I stumbled back, my flashlight falling from my hand and plunging the room into near total darkness. And that's when I felt it. Cold fingers brushed against my arm, followed by a low guttural growl that sent a jolt of terror through my body. I ran, the echoes of my footsteps mingling with the inhuman sounds that followed. The house seemed alive as I fled. Doors slammed, walls groaned, and the very floor seemed to shift beneath me. By the time I reached the front door, I was breathless, my chest heaving as though I'd run a marathon. But the nightmare wasn't over. Outside, the forest was alive with movement. Shadows darted between the trees, and the wind carried a chorus of whispers that sent chills down my spine. My car was the only sanctuary, and I didn't stop running until I was inside, locking the doors and slamming my hand on the ignition. As I sped away, the headlights briefly illuminated a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was the same figure I'd seen in the mirror, its dark form barely visible against the trees. Even now, safe in my home, I feel its presence. Black Hollow doesn't let you leave, not entirely. Its shadows cling to you, its whispers echo in your mind. And at night, when the world is quiet and the darkness closes in, I can feel its cold fingers reaching for me once again. It was one of those dare-you situations that started innocently enough. A friend of mine had told me about Blackwood, an abandoned mining town hidden high in the mountains, a place nearly erased from local memory. We were hanging out in a mountain town nearby, and he half-jokingly dared me to visit it, saying, "No one goes up there, man. Locals say it's cursed, haunted. You wouldn't last an hour alone." Being a bit of a thrill seeker and a horror fan, I took the bait. I wanted to prove that all those creepy stories were just that. Stories. So, early one foggy October afternoon, I packed up a flashlight, my camera, and a couple of supplies, then set out to find Blackwood. It was supposed to be simple. A quick visit, snap a few eerie photos, and head back with a story of my own. But the journey itself was unsettling. The directions I had were rough at best. Locals had almost erased Blackwood from the map. The road was barely visible, winding up steep mountainsides, hugged by tall, twisted trees whose branches seemed to reach down toward me. It wasn't long before my GPS lost signal, and I realized I was on my own, left to follow a crumbling path that seemed to disappear into the dense woods ahead. Hours later, as the fog grew heavier, I finally saw it. Blackwood, perched at the edge of a cliff like some decaying skeleton. The buildings were gray and hollowed, their frames sagging as if weighed down by invisible burdens. My excitement was quickly replaced by an eerie sense of unease, as if the town itself was watching my every step. I parked my car at the edge of what seemed to be the town's main street. The silence was overpowering, a heavy stillness that muffled even my own footsteps. Abandoned buildings lined the dirt road, leaning and rotting in the mist. Rusted mining carts sat forgotten on the side, their wheels half buried in the earth, remnants of a time long past. The first building I approached looked like an old general store. Its windows were shattered and the door hung loosely on one hinge. I peered inside, shining my flashlight into the darkness. Dust floated in thick clouds, illuminated by my light, and rows of empty shelves stretched into the shadows. but something caught my eye. A faint footprint in the dust, leading deeper into the store. As I took a step forward, a sound echoed from the back. Faint, rhythmic tapping, like someone tapping a metal pipe. My heart pounded, but curiosity pulled me in. I followed the noise to a storage room, its walls lined with shelves and boxes that hadn't been touched in decades. The tapping stopped just as I entered, leaving an almost deafening silence. That's when I noticed something scrawled on the wall in what looked like red chalk. "Don't look back." Chills ran down my spine as I read the words, my flashlight flickering for a moment. The air was thick and stale, and that sense of being watched grew stronger. I turned to leave the store, but as I reached the door, a faint whisper drifted through the air. It was a single word so quiet I almost didn't catch it. "Wait." I spun around, shining my flashlight wildly into the shadows. But there was nothing. Just rows of empty shelves and the thick, suffocating silence. I backed out of the store and returned to the street, my mind racing. I tried to laugh it off, convincing myself it was just nerves or the wind playing tricks on me. As I walked further down the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Shadows seemed to shift in the corners of my vision, disappearing whenever I turned to look. The buildings loomed around me, their empty windows like hollow eyes staring down, silent witnesses to whatever had happened here. I reached what looked like an old saloon. The door was slightly ajar, creaking as I pushed it open. Inside, chairs lay scattered across the floor, some tipped over as if left in a hurry. Dust-coated glasses sat on tables untouched for decades. The smell of damp wood and something metallic filled the air. I made my way to the back of the room, my footsteps echoing on the wooden floorboards. Then suddenly I felt it. A cold draft, chilling me to the bone. The air grew colder, and my breath appeared in puffs as I exhaled. Just as I turned to leave, a soft, rhythmic thumping came from above, like footsteps crossing the second floor. I was alone, or so I thought. Gathering my courage, I crept up the narrow, creaking staircase, my heart racing. At the top, a narrow hallway stretched out before me, doors lining each side. The floorboards groaned under my weight, and the air was so cold it felt like it was pressing down on me. I opened the first door slowly. The room was empty, save for a single chair and a large mirror on the far wall. But as I shone my flashlight over the mirror, something caught my eye. A smudged handprint smeared across the glass, as if someone had tried to claw their way out. I backed away, closing the door and moving to the next room. But just as I reached for the handle, I heard it. A whisper, soft and clear, right in my ear. "Don't leave me." I stumbled back, my heart racing. That was enough for me. I turned and bolted down the stairs, back out onto the street. But as I reached the bottom, I froze. Standing at the far end of the street was a figure, cloaked in shadows. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel its gaze locked onto me. The fog thickened around us, swirling in the cold air. I blinked, and the figure was gone, leaving only the eerie silence behind. Terrified, I ran toward my car, but as I reached it, I noticed something strange. Deep, fresh footprints leading from the car door back into the town. My own tracks. Except I hadn't left them. Panic surged through me as I jumped into the car, fumbling with the keys. Just as the engine roared to life, I looked up and saw them. Figures standing in the windows of each building, their hollow eyes staring at me, unblinking, watching as I drove away. The road back was a blur, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. But just as I reached the main road, my phone vibrated. I glanced down to see a text from an unknown number. It simply read, "Come back soon." I tossed the phone aside, refusing to look at it again. But the nightmares haven't stopped. Every night I see them, the shadows waiting for me, calling me back to Blackwood, as if the town itself had marked me. Some places are abandoned for a reason. Blackwood is one of those places. And if you ever find yourself on that mountain looking at that old crumbling road leading into the fog, do yourself a favor. Turn around. Because whatever lives there, whatever waits in the shadows, it never lets you go. Moving into a new house is supposed to be exciting, right? But what if the place you call home doesn't want you there? This isn't just a story about creaky floors or flickering lights. No, this is the kind of story that keeps you up at night wondering if you're ever truly alone. Tonight we're diving into a tale that will make you question the walls around you, the shadows in the corner, and every sound you hear when the house should be quiet. A young family's dream home turns into something else entirely, something much darker, much colder. By the end, you'll see why some doors should never be opened. Let's begin. It all started on a crisp autumn afternoon. Emma and Daniel, along with their 6-year-old daughter Lily, had just bought a charming Victorian house on the outskirts of a sleepy little town. It was perfect, or so they thought. High ceilings, a sprawling backyard, and enough history to make it feel special. The previous owners had sold it at a suspiciously low price, but Emma chalked it up to the market. People get desperate, she had said. The first few days were uneventful. Boxes were unpacked, rooms were painted, and life began to settle into its usual rhythm. But it didn't take long for small, strange things to happen. At first, they were easy to brush off. A misplaced set of keys, lights turning off on their own, and the faint smell of something burnt wafting through the air. Old wiring, Daniel said with a shrug. But Emma wasn't so sure. The smell didn't linger in one place, it moved like it was alive. Things took a darker turn one night when Emma was tucking Lily into bed. "Mommy, who's the lady in the hallway?" Lily asked innocently, her wide eyes peering past her mother's shoulder. Emma froze. There was no one there. "There's no lady, sweetheart. You must have imagined it," Emma said, trying to mask the unease in her voice. But Lily was adamant. "She's there every night. She watches me." The next morning, Daniel laughed it off. "Kids have vivid imaginations," he said. But even he couldn't explain the shadowy handprints they found on Lily's bedroom window, on the outside, 3 stories up. As the weeks passed, the incidents grew more intense. Footsteps echoed through the halls at odd hours. The family dog Max refused to go into the basement, growling and barking at the closed door. Lily began to sleepwalk, often ending up in front of that same basement door, staring at it with a blank expression. One evening, Emma decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight and a shaky resolve, she descended the creaking stairs into the basement. It was cold, unnaturally so. The air felt heavy, and there was a faint humming noise that seemed to come from the walls themselves. As she shone her flashlight around, the beam caught something etched into the stone foundation. Symbols, carved deep and precise, forming a circle. When Daniel joined her later, he brushed it off as old graffiti. But the humming sound stayed with Emma long after they'd gone back upstairs. That night, she dreamed of those symbols. Dreamed they were glowing red, pulsing like a heartbeat. The breaking point came during a thunderstorm. The family huddled in the living room, the wind howling outside. The lights flickered, then went out entirely. "It's just the storm," Daniel said, trying to keep everyone calm. But then came the laughter. It was faint at first, barely audible over the storm, but it grew louder and more distinct. A high-pitched, maniacal giggle that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Emma grabbed Lily and held her close. "Daniel, what is that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Before he could respond, the basement door slammed open with a force that shook the house. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. Daniel grabbed a baseball bat and cautiously approached the basement. As he reached the top of the stairs, the humming returned, louder this time. "Don't go down there," Emma pleaded, but Daniel was already descending. Minutes passed. Then a scream, a guttural, primal sound that made Emma's blood run cold. Daniel stumbled back up the stairs, his face pale and his eyes wide. "We're leaving, now." "What did you see?" Emma demanded, but he just shook his head, muttering, "We're not safe here." The family packed a few essentials and fled to a motel that night. Days later, Daniel finally told Emma what he had seen. In the basement, beneath those carved symbols, was a trapdoor. He had opened it expecting to find old storage or maybe a forgotten crawl space. What he found instead was a cavern, its walls lined with bones. In the center, A figure crouched, impossibly thin, with eyes that glowed like embers. It looked up at him and smiled. The house was abandoned soon after. Neighbors reported strange noises and lights in the windows, but no one dared to enter. It was eventually condemned, left to rot and crumble. To this day, locals say if you pass by the house at night, you can still hear the laughter carried on the wind. The house at Blackwood Hollow. It was a crisp autumn evening when Ethan arrived at Blackwood Hollow, a place he hadn't set foot in for nearly 2 decades. His childhood town was unchanged, sleepy and quiet, with the same dense forest at the edge of the town that he had played in as a child. But the house, that house loomed larger in his mind than any other memory. It had sat empty for years, an old crumbling mansion at the edge of the hollow, hidden by shadowy trees. Some said it was cursed, while others insisted it was haunted. Ethan used to laugh at those stories, but standing there now, under the darkening sky, he felt a chill that went straight to his bones. Ethan told himself he was only there to sort through a few belongings, retrieve a few heirlooms, and finally put the place up for sale. It was just bricks and wood, nothing more. Yet, as he approached the house, his steps grew heavier, his heart pounding harder in his chest. The house loomed before him, a shadowed behemoth of twisted vines and broken windows, its stone walls covered in dark stains that looked almost like blood under the faint dying light. He climbed the steps to the door, feeling as if he were being watched by unseen eyes. The door creaked open with a groan that echoed through the empty house, and a blast of cold air hit him like an icy breath. Inside, the house was deathly silent, its dark, vast rooms swallowing his footsteps as he moved through the hallway. It was a silence so profound that he could hear his own heartbeat, and every creak of the floor sounded like thunder in the stillness. As he stepped into the main hall, the familiar smell hit him. Damp earth, rotting wood, and something metallic like old blood. He remembered this smell from his childhood, when he would lie awake at night, terrified by the strange noises that came from the basement. His parents always dismissed it, brushing it off as just the house settling, but Ethan had never been convinced. Something deep inside had always warned him to stay away from the basement door. Shadows seemed to watch him from every corner, as if the house itself was alive, breathing, waiting. He held his flashlight tightly, sweeping its beam over the peeling wallpaper, the broken furniture, the faint handprints smudged onto the walls. But the worst part was the silence, thick, oppressive, and heavy. He felt as if he were submerged in water, each breath more difficult than the last, each creak of the floorboards louder than before. Then he heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from upstairs. It was soft, almost imperceptible, like fingernails scraping against wood. Ethan froze. His breath caught in his throat, listening. The scratching stopped, leaving an unnerving silence in its wake. He shook it off, convincing himself it was probably a rodent, or the wind. But as he climbed the staircase, the feeling of unease grew stronger. Shadows seemed to close in around him, stretching and twisting in the flashlight's beam. When he reached the top, he saw the door to the attic was slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. With a deep breath, he pushed the door open, feeling a rush of cold air wash over him, as if the attic itself had been waiting. The smell up there was worse, stale and putrid, like something rotting. His flashlight flickered as he scanned the room, revealing strange markings etched into the walls, jagged symbols he didn't recognize, spiraling into strange patterns that seemed almost alive. Then he saw it, a small, dust-covered box in the far corner of the attic. It was out of place, somehow untouched in this decaying room. Against his better judgment, he approached it, his footsteps echoing eerily in the silence. As he knelt to examine the box, he noticed something else. A dark stain on the floor beneath it, spreading out like a shadow. He lifted the lid, and inside was a photograph. It was a faded picture of his mother, smiling, standing in front of the house. But there was something off about her eyes. They looked hollow, empty, as if she wasn't really there. He shivered, putting the photograph back in the box, and as he did, he felt it. A cold hand gripping his shoulder. He spun around, but there was no one there, just darkness, thick and suffocating, pressing in on him from all sides. And then he heard it. A whisper, faint and chilling, echoing through the attic. "Ethan, come downstairs." His heart raced, every nerve screaming at him to get out, but something held him there. The whisper came again, soft and urgent, as if calling him from deep within the walls. He turned and fled down the stairs, the whisper following him, growing louder with each step. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, he felt a cold draft coming from the basement. He had never been down there before. His parents had always kept it locked, and he'd never questioned it. But now, the door was slightly open, beckoning him down into the darkness. Ethan hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to turn back. But the whisper came again, more insistent, pulling him forward. He gripped his flashlight and pushed the door open, feeling a blast of frigid air wash over him. The steps creaked under his weight as he descended into the darkness, the smell of decay growing stronger with each step. At the bottom, he found himself in a narrow, stone-walled room lined with strange symbols carved into the walls, similar to those in the attic. His flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows across the walls, and he felt a shiver run down his spine. Then he saw it. An old wooden chair in the center of the room, with frayed ropes hanging from the armrests, as if someone had been bound there. And on the floor around the chair were more dark stains, pooling and spreading like blood. His flashlight flickered again, and for a moment he thought he saw something. A figure hunched and twisted, standing in the shadows at the edge of the room. He blinked and it was gone, but the feeling of dread lingered, pressing down on him like a weight. The whisper came again, this time closer, filling the room. "Ethan, why did you come back?" His hand tightened on the flashlight as he backed toward the stairs, his heart pounding in his chest. But as he turned to leave, the basement door slammed shut, trapping him in darkness. Panic surged through him as he banged on the door, screaming, but his voice was swallowed by the shadows. And then he felt it, a presence cold and malevolent creeping closer, filling the room with an oppressive darkness. He spun around, shining his flashlight into the blackness, and saw a face, a twisted, contorted face with hollow eyes and a gaping mouth, inches from his own. Its breath was cold, filling his lungs with a chill that felt like death. He stumbled back, tripping over the chair and falling to the ground. The figure loomed over him, its face twisting into a ghastly smile, and he felt a cold, bony hand grip his arm, pulling him deeper into the darkness. As the shadows closed in around him, he heard the whisper again, soft and mocking. "You shouldn't have come back." And then, silence. Ethan was never seen again. The house at Blackwood Hollow still stands, a dark, rotting monument to the secrets it holds. Some say you can still hear him screaming in the basement, his voice echoing through the hollow, a warning to those who dare to enter. I'll never forget the night my best friend Danny and I decided to explore the old St. Willard Asylum. It's one of those places you hear about in urban legends, the ones people swear are haunted, the ones where people claim they've seen things no one would ever believe. St. Willard was a crumbling, decaying shell on the edge of a forgotten town, and it had been abandoned for decades. Its past was filled with tragedy and secrets, a mental hospital that had been the center of unspeakable experiments and rumors of patients vanishing without a trace. Locals said that if you stayed there past nightfall, you'd never come back. But to us, those warnings were nothing more than a challenge. Danny and I were amateur ghost hunters, and like most thrill seekers, we were driven by a need to capture something truly terrifying, something that would make our names. And St. Willard was the kind of place that promised exactly that. We arrived just before sunset, our car rattling as it came to a stop in the gravel parking lot. The asylum loomed before us, its broken windows and crumbling walls casting twisted shadows across the ground. The wind whistled through the hollowed-out building, making it sound like it was breathing, like it was alive and waiting. We grabbed our gear, flashlights, cameras, and a couple of recorders to capture any EVP or electronic voice phenomena, just in case we managed to find something. As we stood at the entrance, I couldn't help but feel a gnawing sense of dread. This was no ordinary building. It seemed to be watching us, waiting for us to make the first move. The air inside was thick, damp, and reeked of mold and decay. Every step we took echoed through the empty halls, each sound magnified by the silence. The asylum had been stripped bare over the years, but remnants of its past lingered in every corner. Rusted bed frames, broken medical equipment, and faded patient files scattered across the floor. As we walked through the main corridor, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Shadows seemed to flicker and dance just out of sight, and the creaking of the old building made it feel as though something was following close behind. We started exploring the patient rooms on the first floor. Each room was a tiny, depressing cell with a small window and a metal bed frame. Some of the rooms had writing on the walls, desperate messages scrawled by patients who had likely been forgotten by the world. In one room, the words "Help me" were scratched into the paint over and over, the letters growing more jagged and frantic as they filled the wall. I ran my fingers over the marks, feeling the fear and despair that had been etched into them so long ago. It was like a silent scream from the past, echoing through the years. Danny was braver than me, always the first to push forward into the darkness, always the first to laugh off the eerie sounds and shadows. He led the way down a long corridor that seemed to stretch on forever, our flashlights barely piercing the gloom. The air grew colder as we walked, and I could feel a heavy weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. We both started to notice a strange sound, an almost imperceptible hum that seemed to come from the walls themselves. It was faint, like a distant whisper, but it filled the silence in a way that made my skin crawl. We reached a set of double doors at the end of the hallway, and Danny gave me a look that said, "Are you ready?" I nodded, though every part of me wanted to turn back. Beyond those doors lay the basement, the place where, according to legend, the worst of the asylum's horrors had occurred. No one knew what was down there. The few people who had explored it had never returned, or so the stories went. But we were here for proof, and proof lay in the darkest corners of the building. The basement stairs were steep and narrow, each step creaking under our weight. The smell of damp and rot grew stronger as we descended, and the darkness seemed to thicken, wrapping around us like a shroud. By the time we reached the bottom, our flashlights barely seemed to penetrate the shadows. The walls were lined with pipes, some of them leaking a thick, dark liquid that smelled faintly metallic. It was like stepping into another world, a place where light and hope didn't exist. We followed the corridor, our footsteps echoing down the empty hall. At one point, we came across an old examination room, its door slightly ajar. Inside, there was a rusted metal table and cabinets filled with dusty jars containing what looked like body parts. I could see something floating in one of the jars, a distorted shape that might have been a heart or a lung, preserved in a murky yellowish liquid. The sight made my stomach turn, and I had to look away, but Danny was fascinated. He leaned in, muttering about how we'd finally found the evidence we needed. That was when we heard it, a soft, shuffling sound coming from the far end of the corridor. We froze, straining to hear. It was a slow, dragging noise, like someone or something was moving toward us. Danny's grip on his flashlight tightened, his knuckles white. He whispered, "Did you hear that?" I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was right outside the room. We pressed ourselves against the wall, holding our breath as the shuffling passed by the door. Through the crack in the door, I caught a glimpse of something, a dark, hunched figure, its head lolling to one side, as if its neck had been broken. The figure paused, its head twisting slightly, as if it could sense our presence. I could feel my pulse racing, my mind screaming at me to run, but I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure moved on, disappearing into the shadows. Danny and I looked at each other, our eyes wide with terror. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't human. and it wasn't alone. We stepped back into the corridor, moving as quietly as possible, but every sound seemed amplified in the silence. The shuffling had faded, but I could still feel its presence lurking somewhere nearby. As we made our way through the basement, we began to notice things. Strange symbols scratched into the walls, like some kind of ancient language. Some of the symbols looked almost ritualistic, as if they were meant to summon or contain something dark and terrible. I ran my fingers over one of the markings, feeling a strange energy radiating from it, like a faint electric shock. Suddenly, we heard a door slam somewhere in the distance, followed by a low, guttural growl that echoed through the halls. We turned, shining our flashlights down the corridor, but there was nothing there. The sound came again, louder this time, and I realized with horror that it was coming from behind us. We turned and ran, our footsteps pounding against the floor as the growling grew closer, filling the air with a sense of impending doom. We stumbled into a large open room that looked like an old operating theater. Rows of seats rose up around us, and at the center of the room was a metal table, stained with dark, rusty marks. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something was lurking in the shadows waiting for us to let our guard down. Danny whispered, "Let's get out of here," and I couldn't agree more. But as we turned to leave, we heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing through the theater. A cold chill washed over me, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Something was there, watching us, waiting for us to make a move. Then, the lights flickered on, casting a sickly greenish glow over the room. In the corner, barely visible in the dim light, was a figure, a tall, shadowy figure with elongated limbs and eyes that seemed to glow in the dark. It didn't move, but I could feel its gaze piercing through me, filling me with an indescribable terror. Danny grabbed my arm and we ran, not daring to look back. The footsteps followed us, growing louder and faster as we raced through the halls, desperate to find our way out. We finally burst through the doors and into the night, gasping for breath. But even as we stumbled to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I glanced back at the asylum, and in one of the windows, I saw it. The shadowy figure watching us, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. We sped away, leaving the asylum behind, but the memory of that night still haunts me. To this day, I don't know what we saw in the basement of St. Willard Asylum, but I do know one thing. Some places are better left forgotten, and some horrors are better left unseen.